Ethan Blackwood never believed in love. To him, marriage was nothing more than a tool, a way to consolidate power. But when his fiancée, Vanessa Sterling, betrayed him just days before their wedding, he realized marriage could also be a weapon. Vanessa had mocked him. She thought he would be broken, devastated at the sight of her running off with another man. But Ethan wasn't the kind of man to be humiliated so easily. If Vanessa wanted to play games, he would play on his own terms. And Isla Whitmore was the perfect pawn for his revenge. A simple maid with no status, no family name, someone Vanessa had always looked down upon. What better way to get back at her than to marry the one person she deemed beneath her? So, the day after his breakup with Vanessa, Ethan announced his engagement to Isla. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I want you to be my wife." His voice was cold, unyielding. Isla's eyes widened in shock. "Are you joking?" "I never joke." Ethan didn't love Isla. She was nothing more than a means to an end. But what he didn't know was that this decision would change his life forever. The wedding was quick and cold, devoid of love or emotion, nothing more than a business deal. Ethan didn't care if Isla's dress was beautiful, nor did he acknowledge the stunned looks from the guests as she walked down the aisle. To him, this was just another chess move, and Isla was the perfect pawn to drive Vanessa insane. Vanessa was there. She wore an extravagant gown, standing among the guests with a cold smirk. Isla could feel the disdain in her gaze, but it didn't matter, because Ethan didn't even spare his bride a glance. The ceremony was brief, their vows spoken like a script. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan simply took Isla's hand, sliding the ring onto her finger with no warmth, no tenderness. After the ceremony, Isla assumed she would be given her own room, but Ethan suddenly pulled her close, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered, "You'll be sleeping in my bed." Isla froze, her eyes widening in shock. "Why?" Ethan's gaze flickered toward Vanessa, a smirk playing on his lips. "Because she's watching." A pang of realization struck Isla. So this was all just to get back at Vanessa. When they arrived at the Blackwood estate, Isla still struggled to accept the reality that she would have to share a bed with a man who didn't love her. But Ethan didn't care about her feelings. He shrugged off his jacket, leaned back against the bed, and said casually, "Don't overthink this, Isla. This is just an act, and you need to play your role well." Isla clenched her fists, her mind in turmoil. She never thought her life would change so drastically in just one night. Isla couldn't sleep. The room was too large, too unfamiliar, and the man lying beside her was even more unsettling. Ethan Blackwood, her husband by title, yet a complete stranger to her. He lay on his back, one arm draped over his forehead, eyes half closed. But Isla knew he wasn't asleep. After what felt like an eternity, Isla turned onto her side, keeping as much distance from Ethan as possible. As she shifted, the blanket slipped slightly, revealing a faint scar on her shoulder. Ethan's eyes snapped open. It wasn't an ordinary scar. It was thin, slightly raised, as if it had been there for years. In the dim glow of the night, fragments of a forgotten memory resurfaced. A river, a boy struggling against a powerful current, a girl diving in, risking everything to pull him to safety. And then, when he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was blood, trickling from a fresh wound on her shoulder. Ethan's pulse pounded. Slowly, he propped himself up on one elbow, his sharp gaze fixed on Isla. Could she be that girl? But Isla seemed unaware of his sudden change in demeanor. She simply pulled the blanket higher, turning her back to him, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside his mind. Ethan couldn't look away from that scar. He remembered it vividly. The girl who saved him had promised she would never forget him. But when he had returned to find her, she was gone. Could it really be her? Ethan clenched his jaw, his thoughts tangled. He couldn't jump to conclusions just yet. He needed to be sure. Ethan was not a man who easily fixated on things, but ever since their wedding night, he couldn't stop thinking about the scar on Isla's shoulder. He remembered it too well. It was the same injury the girl who had saved him bore all those years ago. But one scar wasn't enough. Ethan needed more proof. So he began paying close attention to Isla, silently observing her every habit, every reaction. And slowly, fragments of lost memories started falling into place. First clue: Isla had a very distinct habit. Whenever she was nervous, she would fiddle with a small silver necklace, turning the pendant between her fingers. Ethan remembered the girl from his past had the same habit, holding on to a similar necklace whenever she was anxious. Second clue: Isla loved nature. One morning, Ethan walked through the garden and saw Isla barefoot on the grass, eyes closed, as if relishing the sensation. The sight hit him like a wave of déjà vu. The girl who had saved him also loved walking barefoot, once saying that it made her feel free. Third clue: Isla reacted strangely when he mentioned the river. During dinner one evening, Ethan casually asked, "Do you like swimming?" Isla froze for a fraction of a second, her eyes flickering with something unreadable before shaking her head. "No, I don't really like water." Ethan stared at her, heart pounding. The girl from his past had almost drowned while saving him. Maybe that fear had stayed with her. Fourth clue: Isla had an unconscious reflex. One night, Ethan accidentally dropped a glass, the sharp sound shattering the quiet air. Isla flinched violently, and by instinct, her hand flew to her left shoulder, where her scar was. Ethan stilled. That was exactly how the girl from his past had reacted when he had asked about her injury. Ethan had no more doubts. Isla was the girl who had once saved his life. But she didn't recognize him. Or maybe she had forgotten everything. Ethan wasn't going to tell her just yet. But the realization consumed him. Every time he looked at Isla, he could no longer see just the maid he married out of revenge. He saw the girl who had once risked everything for him. He wanted to understand why she had ended up here, why she didn't remember him, and most of all, why fate had brought them back together like this. Was it just coincidence? Or had he unknowingly spent his whole life searching for her? Ethan had never believed in fate, but some things were too coincidental to ignore. For weeks, he had watched Isla, gathering every clue to confirm what he already suspected, that she was the girl who had once risked her life to save him. But she didn't remember him. Or maybe she had forgotten everything. That night, as Isla was preparing for bed, Ethan spoke up suddenly. "Do you believe in fate?" Isla hesitated. It was the first time Ethan had ever spoken to her like this. There was no coldness, no authority, just quiet contemplation, as if he had been carrying something heavy in his mind. "I've never really thought about it," Isla answered truthfully. Ethan watched her intently, his fingers unconsciously brushing against the scar on her shoulder. Isla tensed, stepping back slightly, but Ethan's gaze never left her. "Do you remember ever saving someone?" His voice was low. Isla frowned. "What are you talking about?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, moving closer to her. He locked eyes with her, his voice calm but firm. "Years ago, I fell into a river. I struggled against the freezing current, convinced I was going to die, until a girl jumped in and pulled me out." Isla froze. "She got hurt saving me." Ethan's fingers traced the faint scar on her shoulder. "Right here." The world stood still. Isla's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat as fragments of forgotten memories suddenly rushed back. A river, a terrified boy, a promise. "We've met before." Ethan's voice was rough. "You saved me, and I promised I'd marry you." Isla took a shaky step back, clutching the fabric of her nightgown. "No, that can't be." Ethan didn't push her. He simply watched, letting her piece together the memories herself. And then Isla remembered. She remembered the boy with piercing blue eyes, remembered that cold afternoon when she had dragged him onto the riverbank, trembling from the icy water. She remembered how he had stared at her, gratitude shining in his gaze. And she remembered his promise. "One day, when I grow up, I'll marry you." Isla raised a hand to her mouth, her heart pounding. The boy she had once saved was now the man she had married. Ethan took a deep breath, a rare softness flickering in his eyes. "I don't know why fate brought us back together like this, but I do know one thing." He paused, his gaze steady. "I'm not going to lose you again." Isla couldn't sleep. The entire night she lay awake, her mind spinning with memories that had just resurfaced. Ethan was the boy she had saved all those years ago, the boy with deep blue eyes, the one who had held onto her hand on the riverbank, innocently promising to marry her someday. She had forgotten. She had truly forgotten that promise. But Ethan hadn't. He had remembered. He had even searched for her. Isla gripped the blanket tightly, her emotions tangled. Ethan had always been a mystery to her. Since the day they married, he had never shown his true emotions, never looked at her as a real wife. So why now, when she looked at him, did everything suddenly feel different? In the days that followed, Isla started to change. She tried to keep her distance from Ethan, but the more she avoided him, the more she found herself drawn to him. She began noticing the little things about him, the way he drank his coffee black but always left a sugar cube untouched on the saucer, the way his fingers idly tapped against the table when he was deep in thought, the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. Their private moments started to feel different, like the way Ethan's hand would gently rest on her back while guiding her through a crowd, or the way his gaze stayed on her just a second too long. She no longer saw him as cold and distant. Ethan no longer kept his walls up, as if he was patiently waiting for her to realize something. But what unsettled Isla the most was herself. Why did her heart race whenever Ethan was near? Why did she feel an inexplicable disappointment when he wasn't at breakfast? Why did his gaze make her feel things she never expected to? One late night, Isla sat by the window, staring at the distant city lights, lost in thought. She had believed this marriage was just an act, a way for Ethan to spite Vanessa, a contract devoid of real emotions. But now, Isla wasn't so sure. Ethan never pushed her. He never demanded she feel anything for him. But his patience, his quiet kindness, the way he looked at her, it was impossible to ignore. And that terrified her. Falling in love meant being vulnerable. It meant risking heartbreak. Isla had spent years surviving, keeping her heart guarded. She had convinced herself that love wasn't meant for people like her, that she was only here because of circumstance. But every time Ethan looked at her, every time his fingers brushed against hers, she felt something shift. Maybe, just maybe, she wanted to stay. In the days that followed, something shifted between Isla and Ethan. She no longer avoided his gaze, and Ethan, instead of keeping his distance, began creating moments of closeness between them. They were no longer just two people bound by a marriage of convenience. In the mornings, Isla would find a cup of tea waiting for her, the exact kind she liked. Ethan never mentioned it, but she knew it was him. At events, Ethan always rested a hand on the small of her back, light yet firm, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. Their conversations became effortless. Isla no longer felt the need to be guarded around him. Instead, Ethan always listened, as if every word she spoke mattered to him. And then, there were moments that made Isla realize something had changed. One evening, she stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air, only to find Ethan already there. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice deep and soothing in the quiet night. Isla shook her head. They stood side by side, saying nothing, just gazing out at the city below. Yet there was something peaceful about the silence between them, something that no longer felt like distance, but comfort. A cool breeze swept through, making Isla shiver. Before she could react, Ethan shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She glanced up, startled by the simple but intimate gesture. Ethan said nothing, but his eyes, the way he looked at her, they spoke louder than words ever could. Slowly, Isla began to understand. She no longer avoided him. She no longer denied the emotions growing inside her. She had once thought this marriage was a mistake. But now, Isla began to wonder, was it fate that had brought her back to Ethan? And now she had a choice to make. Isla spent the entire night thinking. She knew she couldn't keep running anymore. Ethan had said the words she had been too afraid to admit. She wasn't staying because of the past. She wasn't staying because of a childhood promise. She was staying because of him. But if Isla truly accepted that, if she truly let herself love again, what would it mean for her? The next morning, Isla went looking for Ethan. He was standing on the balcony, gazing out at the city. The golden morning light cast a glow over him, making him look both strong and lonely at the same time. She took a deep breath, then stepped beside him. He turned, his eyes flickering with surprise, perhaps because this was the first time Isla had ever sought him out on her own. "You were right," Isla said softly. "I'm not staying because of the past." Ethan said nothing. He just watched her, waiting. Isla clenched her hands. She had never confessed something like this before. But if she didn't say it now, she would regret it forever. "I love you." The words left Isla's lips before she could stop them. And in that moment, everything stilled. Ethan froze. His sharp blue eyes locked onto hers, unreadable, as if he wasn't sure if he had imagined it. Isla's heart pounded. She had spent so long convincing herself this wasn't real, that this wasn't love, but saying it out loud, it felt like the most honest thing she had ever done. "What did you say?" Ethan's voice was rough, uncertain in a way Isla had never heard before. She swallowed hard, took a shaky breath, and then smiled. "I love you, Ethan." This time, there was no hesitation. No obligation, no past debts, just pure, undeniable love. Ethan didn't wait another second. He pulled Isla into his arms, holding her tight. "I've been waiting so long to hear you say that." His voice was rough, filled with emotion, as if he had just let go of a weight he had carried for too long. Isla laughed softly, wrapping her arms around him, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid anymore. She had chosen to stay. For love. And this time, Ethan would never let her go again.